Welcome to Scigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Hi, my name's Rebecca Bloomer and welcome to another episode of Scigest. This week we're going to have a chat with Dr. Samantha Baldwin about indoor growing in New Zealand and some of the work that Plant and Food's been doing in this space. So I'm excited to welcome Sam to Scigest today. Welcome, Sam.
Tēnā koe.
Sam is a multi-talented woman, a wearer of some quite big hats at Plant and Food, one of which is as Science Group Leader of Annual Crops. But another big part of her role, and one which I'm really not familiar with, so I'm quite excited about today's podcast, is as Direction Leader of Plant and Food's work in an area called Horticulture Goes Urban, which is a collection of projects that PFR is working on towards developing cultivars and systems for growing indoors. So, Sam, I wondered if we could start by talking a little bit about what actually is indoor farming. I have a particular picture, maybe some of our listeners will as well, of kind of an ultra high-tech, multi-level system, high-level LED lighting. Potentially there's some robots. Is that really what we mean? Is it a little bit more complex? Can you tell me a bit about that?
Certainly. Indoor growing covers a whole spectrum of growing systems. So it can cover anything from, imagine putting netting over some wood over the top of your plants. You're effectively indoor growing. It's a shade house right through to a greenhouse, so plastic polytunnel, for example, through to a glass house, which has glass. And then moving forward into fully controlled environments, which is where basically the sun is replaced by LED lighting and you're completely providing all the environment inside a room. And then even there's versions of that. So you can have just a room that's growing something. You could have stacked shelves right up to multi-layers within a building.
So we already see versions of that spectrum quite a lot in New Zealand then. We've got everything, I guess, from, say, kind of hail protection and things over some of our outdoor orchards, through obviously lots of glasshouse systems around. To what extent do we also have some of those more high-tech systems now?
Certainly in industries such as medicinal cannabis, there's more indoor growing for that, and that's really about controlling the final product. There's also green growers, for example, that's started in Hamilton there, that's growing indoor leafy greens, as well as 26 Seasons that has been growing leafy greens and stepping into the strawberry production near Foxton. So they're just a couple of examples that are already existing within New Zealand. We have glasshouse producers who are actually increasing the glasshouse footprint as well. So there is more going undercover.
And what are some of the other ways it differs from traditional farming? You've touched a little bit on lighting and kind of environmental control, but presumably you've got potential for different growing media and different kind of management regimes as well.
The interesting thing with indoor growing is purely the options. There are so many options. You can have completely different substrates, which is what you're talking about, with soil right through to actually no substrate. You just directly spray nutrients onto the roots.
That's what we mean by aeroponics.
Aeroponics. Fogponics is another one where you mist it on. There's gels that you could put them on. So it's quite variable there, and it all really depends on how that plant really likes to grow.
So sort of horses for courses, I guess. There's a little bit of a perception, I think, that indoor growing is a new thing or a sudden kind of emergence in the public consciousness, I guess. Can you comment to what extent you think that's true? Is this like a brand new thing?
So unheated glass houses have been around for a long, long time. I believe it started with the Romans wanting to eat, I think it was cucumbers, all year round rather than being limited to the seasons. And then in the 1400s, I think heated glass houses came around.
1400s?
I think it was the Greeks who brought in, but I could be wrong.
Wow. I was thinking this sort of the last century or so. Anyway, that's impressive.
And then what's really come in the last 40, 50 years is the fact that we've used alternate lighting. So that's been kind of the new technology that's come along. And a lot of that was started in Japan, in the plant factories, for example. And in the glass houses, we've gone to kind of hybrid glass houses where they're extending day length by using lighting as well. So more recently, it's just basically got more technical. And it's the advances in the technology that have really enabled the uptake of, well, this is what we can do now. We've got lights that can provide decent intensities, can replicate the sun. We have technology to be able to manage all those growing systems, automate them. So it's that technology drive that's enabling a lot of this to move forward more recently.
Sure. So we've got the tech now. What do you see as some of the kind of, I guess, social or environmental drivers of that change or that interest, though?
So there's a lot of interest in indoor growing as a means for climate resilience, for one. So, for example, we know the climate is changing. We know that there's going to be more marginal land. We're losing prime growing areas to an encroaching sea. We also know that there's going to be more and more days through the seasons that are not going to be good for plants. And so we need to find a way of protecting our growing systems from that erratic climate, but also find other ways of kind of limiting our impact on that climate too. So that's why there's been such a big interest of, well, how do we protect crops? And that's really coming from the, like you said earlier on, even right down to hail netting. We probably wouldn't have thought about that many years ago, but we're getting more and more storms at certain times of the year that will then impact the crop. The other thing that's probably pushing more of that vertical farming is recognising that the world population is expected to get to about 9 billion by 2050. That's the UN projection, which is kind of scary. That means producing a hell of a lot more food to feed that growing population. There's also suggestions that those populations will not be spread evenly around the world. They're probably likely to be in an increasing number of what we call megacities, so cities of 10 million people or more. There, the issue becomes, how do you get food into a city of 10 million people? What does that supply chain look like? How do you get healthy, nutritious food that's relatively fresh to those people? And so then that becomes, well, what if we can grow in those cities to produce that food? Now, of course, what are the chances of having paddocks and orchards in a megacity is going to be pretty slim. And so that's where this indoor growing comes to, in that, well, now we no longer need that space on the ground footprint. We can go up. And given we can recreate the sun, we can recreate the nutrients of the soil, all of that can be controlled. We can now do that in a city setting close to where people live.
So it's really just giving us a lot more tools, I guess, isn't it? We've got pretty big demographic changes forecast. We've got an increasingly unstable climate, and this is an extra layer of security for our food supplies and an extra kind of way that we can maybe utilise some of our land footprint in a more efficient way, particularly where there are a lot of folks around.
For sure. We also have to recognise that the average farmer age is getting quite high, and trying to get new people in to replace those farmers. How do we do that? So there's an increase in, how do we reduce that labour? How do we get around that? And through automation is one possible answer there, of course, too. So there's quite a few drivers there. And of course, if we look at, well, how do we build that resilience? How do we protect our food supply from these extremes? If you think about the cyclone, for example, here in New Zealand, they projected approximately 20 to 30% of the pip fruit will be impacted just by that one event. And if you think about that impact not only on GDP, but also if the wider food product for us to eat, that's quite large. And that was just one event. And there are events that we know are going to continue happening. So we will not replace all of that, but by having that diversity and having some protected, then we at least have something there to move forward.
Yeah, and there's kind of an interesting piece in there too, I think, about the way you potentially expand the places you're able to grow, I guess, because you might imagine that a Gabrielle type event isn't super good for an indoor farm either, but if it means that you're able to grow pip fruit outside of its traditional growing regions, you've perhaps got them in several more locations in a country like New Zealand. So where if you have an adverse weather event, one place, Hawke's Bay, perhaps you've got parallel production that's happening somewhere we wouldn't traditionally do it. And so you've got that whole extra piece there as well, which is kind of an interesting idea, I think. You've actually started to touch on a lot of what I'd hoped you'd answer with my next question, but perhaps you can expand a little bit more. I'm wondering, kind of beyond the resilience discussion, what do you see as some of the benefits of indoor growing? And perhaps thinking particularly compared to traditional outdoor agriculture, are there things that we're able to do more efficiently or in a lower residue way, for example, indoors?
If we think about the extreme in indoor, if we think about completely controlled environment agriculture, there's the opportunity to have a closed system, which means we can control everything that goes in, everything that goes out, perhaps reuse and recycle wherever we can. So we can make that system as efficient as possible. And that's where the research into, well, how would we create these indoor growing packages will also help outdoor growing, is that we'll have to have that great understanding of just exactly what does that plant need, right down to, if you think about individual photon or a molecule, what does it actually need versus what we're giving it? And so we could also improve the outdoor systems too by having that greater understanding of how that plant interacts with all the environment, because we can completely recreate any environment we want. It can be sitting in the Mediterranean at 2 o'clock in the morning. We can create it. We're not limited to what outside is doing. And so we can really make the plant the star. We can build the environment around that plant and give it what it needs, just what it needs, nothing more, and potentially get to the point where we are recycling everything. Even the water that's transpired by the plant can be collected and reused, for example. So there's some of the benefits. Another benefit is, like I say, we're trying to create the ultimate environment for that plant, but mainly for that plant to produce what it is that we want, and that might be a fruit, for example. We can pick that when we know that fruit is perfect. So therefore we'll also reduce food wastage because we will pick it all at exactly the right time. And if we're growing close to consumption, then it can still be fresh and it can be eaten within so many days because it could be straight in the supermarket not long after. So hopefully reducing as much food waste as possible. Also, being in a closed environment, again, if we can control everything that goes into that environment, hopefully we can use really high health growing systems to reduce the chances of any pests and diseases getting into that system, which then means we have less reliance on mechanisms to reduce those, such as pesticides or fungicides, for instance.
So a lot of that sounds amazing, and I think particularly the idea of lower pesticide residues is obviously something that comes up in a lot of surveys of kind of consumer preference and stuff, and that's a big concern for a lot of folks. Lots of potential benefits then, but another potential issue I suppose people might perceive is the idea of, how sustainable is an indoor growing system really if you're having to replicate light that you could just get from outside. For example, controlling an environment, adding supplemental lighting, those are not without energy costs, and that's something that across every aspect of our existence at the moment we're having to increasingly think about managing. So I guess I'm thinking mostly about energy costs. How much of a sustainability issue would you perceive that to be, and are there maybe others as well that we should be aware of and can look at ways of mitigating?
Any farming requires inputs, and in indoor growing, of course, yes, light and temperature control are major users of energy. We all hope that into the future we will become more reliant on energy that's renewable and not burning fossil fuels. We also have the potential, I think, with controlled environment that could we co-locate with other major energy producers and use waste energy, for example. So how can we get better at how we use energy, where we use energy, how can we make the most of the megacities of the future? Are there potential waste energy or excess, for example, carbon dioxide coming from particular industries that could then go in and feed into these systems and produce more plant biomass? Getting innovative is possible with these new technological advances. Something potentially a lot harder if you're in a large orchard away from such cities, for example. And like I say, in the future there's hope that energy cost both in economic but also environmental, will become lower and lower. The lights, for example, that are being used indoors are getting more and more efficient. Also, how the farms are run, can they make most out of actually what's happening outside, so that they're not completely using lots of energy to keep reheating or cooling air within facilities. So there's a lot going on, especially in things like using precision farming to try and maximise the efficiency of these systems. So can we do lots of measuring and sensors, and then how we modify the environment so that we're using as little as possible. At the end of the day, these farms need to make a profit. They need to be economical. And if energy cost is the major cost driver, they're going to do what they can to bring that cost down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, well, number one, you make a really good point that traditional ag is clearly not without its inputs. I mean, how many tractor passes go through your average potato crop, for example? I actually don't know. But you know, it's not the case that it's a magic, oh, well, it's just sunshine outside either, is it? And there are already, I think, some really nice examples of where people are being quite clever with this. So I can't remember if it was you or someone else, but I was pointed to an example of a glasshouse in Australia that was using a solar tower, which was wild to me. I'd never seen those before, but it's kind of this array of mirrors that concentrates light up to a central heating point. I have no idea how to explain actually how that works. I'm not going to try, listeners. But, you know, collecting light essentially in a desert where they otherwise couldn't, using that energy for desalination and using it for supplemental lighting rather than totally trying to, you know, light a black box. It was part of a greenhouse system where it was looking actually incredibly, like wildly taking advantage of growing somewhere they shouldn't have been able to really, but you can desalinate the salt water and you've got all this light, you're in the middle of a desert, and actually now you've got a growing region where you didn't before. And I guess, like you say, if you're being smart about, particularly probably in glasshouse systems, you know, you're measuring the light that's already coming in. You're not just running your lights cause, you're putting them on because now you've got a bunch of cloud cover, or actually you need to extend your day a little bit in this case because of the flowering requirement of a plant or something. But it's not a case of just switching the lights on for the heck of it. Like you say, power is part of their whole cost of production, so there's no incentive on them to be wasteful with it, really.
So the system you're talking about is Sundrop, based in Australia. And so they use from what I understand, they use the sun to heat up the water in the top of a big water tower that sits on top of the tower, and then the steam basically is pushed through. And that drives a lot of it. And something I should bring up too is that even outdoor growers, there's been recent research where they've been playing with supplemental lighting outdoors. So adding LEDs, for example, through the canopy to get more growth in those parts of the plants that wouldn't necessarily see the sun. So, you know, that's what I mean. There's lots of potential feedback for improving efficiencies indoor and outdoor from what knowledge we can gain from the indoor growing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the other thing thinking about it is, you know, we've talked a little bit already about how there's this real spectrum of protected horticulture through very highly controlled multi-level environments, and it's going to obviously be a case of horses for courses too, right? So you mentioned medicinal cannabis before as something that's a nice example of where you really, really highly control an environment to get a really consistent product. And that's asking a very different question than what's the appropriate indoor growing system for my lettuces or my basil, or I don't know, you're possibly not going to start growing wheat out indoors anytime soon, realistically, because it's probably, for now at least, more efficient to keep that stuff outside. But there'll be cases where this is a really fantastic technology and we're doing it now, or we should be moving towards doing it for some of our crops, and others, maybe it's not the obvious solution at the moment. Which kind of leads me to my next question, and the bit that I'm really excited talking about actually is what are we doing? What's happening at Plant and Food? So what are some of the challenges that face our indoor farming systems? How's Plant and Food helping, and how are we, beyond that, sort of how are we looking to the future and trying to prepare now for things that might be forthcoming?
So indoor growing at the moment is mainly focused on leafy greens. And I don't know about you, but leafy greens might be nice, but I don't really want to live off them every single day.
Fair call.
Ever. So we're looking at, well, if you're a consumer in the future, living in your megacity, wanting some really delicious fresh produce, and not keen on leafy greens for this dessert, you might be wanting a strawberry, a a stone fruit, a blueberry, a raspberry, something that's currently very not grown too much in indoor growing. There's more and more strawberries being grown, and certainly some of the other berry crops are in tunnel houses. But actually, what would be involved to try and get some of those more tricky perennial, woody perennials and vines growing in an indoor system? And so we're looking at, rather than bringing outdoor in, what would a plant, if it was truly designed to be indoors, what would it need to look like? What knowledge would we need to make that a reality? And we're kind of using our strengths here in New Zealand in horticulture and breeding of perennial crops to think, well, how would we do that? What knowledge do we need for that? For example, can you imagine a tree being grown in a vertical farming situation? So we're looking at, well, what would be required to make that happen? I mean, there's obvious things of growing dwarfs, making them flower more often, making sure the fruit matures quicker so that they're not taking up too much energy in times when it's producing biomass that we don't really need. When it's in there, it's making fruit that can be harvested. So all that energy, those photons, that energy going into the environment is going into producing nutritious, healthy, sustainable fruit for the consumer of the future. And so we're looking at, what do we need to know? What do we need to know about the genetics of the plant? What do we need to know about that physiology, how the plant interacts with the environment? So we can understand, well, what environment do we need to create for these plants of the future to make them deliver what we want? And we're also looking at, who is the future consumer? Who are these people sitting in the megacities? What is it that they want and need for the future? The hope being that we're used to, as a country, exporting fruit overseas. What if we actually export the growing system? What if we export these growing packages to the people in these megacities of the future? The technology, this is what to grow, this is how to grow it, and this is what you will want to eat because it's got these particular nutrients that will really benefit someone who's sitting in a city. You know, what will be the health and wellness that we'll need to address for those? So that's what we're looking at the moment across different fruit crops and production systems.
So this is kind of the idea that you have a customised indoor growing variety and then a package that sits around that. This is how it's going to grow best. This is the sort of the tech that you need to sit around that to get the most out of the system.
Completely.
That's about right?
Yep, that's right.
So I guess I'm just trying to imagine what that, you say imagine a tree, and guilty as charged of being an annual crop person, so imagine a tree doesn't come naturally, but I guess you're thinking about a lot about plant architecture and dormancy and things like that. Where do the branches go? Does it need branches at all? When, where's it flowering from? Does it have to have a dormant period? Do plants have to? I don't know. Are those kind of the questions that you're thinking along the lines of?
So yeah, we've got research into things like that, architecture. How do we control branching? How do we control the meristems, whether they're going to be floral or vegetative? So obviously if you want lots of fruit, we'll want as many floral, but we'll want enough leaves still available to provide the carbon to then feed into that fruit. Could we go to the other extreme of, what if we got rid of all the biomass that the plant doesn't need? Does it need roots if we're supplying all the nutrients? These are the sorts of really stretchy questions that we want to ask, because climate change, population, it's coming at us, and we need to really rethink how we grow food. And so that really needs this, pun the pun, out of the box thinking of, we've always done it this way, but why? How do we break that down and to understand the individual parts of the whole system to then almost build it back up to make it a really efficient system that can then go on to really feed these really nice, tasty, nutritious food for the future? The other important thing, of course, is a big issue with pollination. That's obviously not an issue when you're eating leaves, but if you want the fruit that come from a flower, most of our crops are pollinated.
And a lot of them are insect pollinated specifically, aren't they?
Insect, things like vanilla, I think is moths. So we're looking at, one, are there completely different insects that might work better in a controlled environment. If you think some of them might need specific light or temperature, photo periods, that might be different to the optimum of a plant. So we might need different types of insect pollinators, and so there's some research going into, well, which ones work best indoors. We're also looking at, well, what if we remove the need for pollination full stop? Can we produce fruit that have no pollination requirements at all? Some may even be completely seedless.
And that's an extension, well, not an extension, but we have already got examples of that as fruits. Bananas, for example, are seedless. So it's an existing idea, but perhaps stretched to some of our crops that haven't traditionally been able to be grown that way. Is that fair?
Sure. There are different ways of getting seedless, though. Some of them might still need pollination.
Right. I guess on the subject of insects, that raises another question that's kind of interesting to me, which is that, like you say, a lot of what we grow indoors now is leafy greens. They have a really short life cycle. Presumably, if you do get some kind of a disease incursion, you're either looking at, a crop loss of several weeks or something, or at least a glasshouse you can empty and clean easily. But a perennial system is designed to hang around a little bit longer. So would you envision different challenges in terms of pest and disease management in those kinds of systems from what we already know we deal with in some of those other short life cycle systems?
As with anything, any crop will bring its own joys when it comes to pests and diseases, as well as different growing systems. There are, of course, different ways of managing that in indoor growing scenarios that might be easier than in outdoor settings too.
And you have already touched on the idea that hopefully you can have a lot more control of what gets in the first place, which is a nice advantage.
Yeah, and most of that will be really making sure you've got high health plants going into that system in the beginning. But as you say, if there is an incursion, it's a matter of removing all the plants, giving it a good clean and starting again, something that's a lot harder in the field. The other thing is, we're wanting to look at the researchers to the perennial at the moment, but why do they need to be perennial?
Again, with my annual crops hat on, yes. Annualise those things. Really interesting points, I have to say. I probably can't ask you this because I feel like it's a little bit like asking a mum who their favourite child is, but do you have a particular, you see a whole view of Hawke Goes Urban that most of us don't get to here at Plant and Food. So is there any project or a couple of projects that particularly have kind of grabbed your imagination?
That's really hard because there's my direction leader hat on and then there's my scientist really curious hat on. And, just how far can we explore the system? Can we get to a point, for example, where we have modular plants? Can we have particular fruit on demand? This is really stretchy stuff and by all means not going to be addressed by Hawke Goes Urban in the near future. But by understanding the little parts of that, how can we get to a point where, for example, we have a program that's looking at the other extreme of, well, why can't we just grow an apple, for example? Why do we grow the tree? Why don't we grow the cells and recreate a fruit? Another program that was looking at, well, can we graft different plants together so we've got the optimum bits of the plant and we're producing what we want on those? Can we get to a point where there's synthetic scions, for example, which is, we can attach the fruiting part to and give the plant all the food it needs to create what we want, right to, well, actually, some of the plants we might want to design for an indoor growing system could be really useful for outdoors. We just haven't looked at it that way because we've been so focused on just doing incremental improvements on business as usual.
Yeah, sure. And I guess a lot of our the trite example is the internet, but a lot of our kind of big changes as humans through science have been potentially kind of incidental surprise discoveries along the way, right? So that there's all kinds of, you can start out down a particular path with a project and maybe you learn something cool, but you don't necessarily ultimately apply that in the way that you thought. So lots of interesting stuff to come out of this, I think. With some of those more, certainly there's stretchy science projects, but some of those more kind of stretchy ideas in terms of how you might ultimately produce a fruit, do you imagine a different level of consumer perception of those?
Potentially. The interesting thing we have with consumer perception, so we've been funding some research into this in particular for the last few years. And of course, you're surveying people with their knowledge of what they know now. And some of the research we're doing is probably going to come out in many years from now. So what will those future consumer perceptions be? And it's interesting knowing the drivers of consumers at the moment. But what we've also been trying to look at and change is, well, there's kind of context to that. You've got different type of people with different views within an individual country. But then you've got different drivers in different countries. You know, in some countries, food security is a real issue, so they might have different drivers. There might be other countries where food safety is a major driver, and therefore having a completely automated growing system that's run by robots might seem really, appetizing to say. It really depends on where you're from and what you're used to. In a country like ours, where you can just go in the supermarket, grab what you want, organics if you want it, imported if you want it, we've got a lot more choice. And so we can kind of make those decisions. But I think it's come into us. I mean, recently when you think about all the discussions we had around the, $20 cauliflower or whatever it got to, it mattered. And people are asking, well, how come there's only so many fresh produce on certain things like, one of the supermarkets has a list of lines that it will keep at a certain monetary value over winter, for example. Fresh produce does matter to us, and increasingly as these weather patterns happen and things become scarce, we're going to actually start to care about what food is available when. And that could actually then impact our decision making that we actually choose when we step into a supermarket and buy. That's a bit different to what we say we'll do on a survey.
Yeah, fair point. And I think for a lot of us, between the great flour panic of COVID and the recent North Island horrendous summer that they've had, and even down here in the South Island, we're really seeing some of the impacts of that on our shelves, let alone, talking to family in Hawke's Bay, what they're seeing locally. I think you're right, that starts to, for a lot of folks, change perspectives a bit. And it's a little bit, it is what you know, and it's also what you think you know. So often we have some ideas that may or may not be true about what it means to be organic or conventionally grown or indoor grown, and our own set of biases against all of these. I hadn't really thought about the cultural context either, so that's a really interesting point too, I think. I guess to sum up for a final question, how do you imagine this looks in the context of the future of horticulture for New Zealand specifically? So we've got some ideas about what it might look like to have a megacity. Do you think, is Auckland a megacity at some point, or is this something that sits alongside our existing growing systems in different regions? How would you see indoor growing complementing or changing how we do things here?
Indoor growing is going to complement. It's not an instead of, it's an and. And the major probably driver as a consumer for indoor growing is I can have access to fruit whenever I want it. It's always going to taste the same. It's always going to look the same. It's going to be consistent. I can have a consistent supply. The grower will be completely linked to the supermarket. I can go in and I can probably know the price that that's going to be because there will be a consistent supply. And that's where indoor growing for some of those crops where berries, the really seasonal crops that don't export well, the ones that have a short shelf life, will probably be the key drivers for indoor growing in New Zealand. And like I said, it's also that transition around not just being the growers, but also having the producers of the final fruit, but also having that knowledge of how to grow and selling the how to grow just as much as the actual final product. So that's where I think horticulture in New Zealand is going to go. We also have to understand that there's a big importance here for Māori. They tend to be on marginal land, so have much bigger impact probably on them when it comes to climate change and being able to produce their own food.
Sure, and obviously they are really fundamentally linked to where they are, right? You're not going to ask an iwi from Northland to just up sticks and come down to the South Island quite as easily as perhaps some of us would consider up and moving where we're doing things either.
For sure, and so then it's, well, how can these technologies help provide some food security for them too? Are there options, wider options now for
different
them.
land use options too. Yeah, interesting point. It's been a really fascinating discussion, Sam. Would really love if we could revisit this actually in 2 or 3 years' time and see where HGU's got to in the interim. Some good stuff to come. But in the interest of time, and thank you for a hugely interesting discussion, but I guess we better wrap it up. So thank you as well to our listeners for tuning into Scigest today. If you'd like to hear more of our podcasts, perhaps a follow-up on HGU at some point in the future, do check out either our Scigest podcast page, or you can subscribe to our channel on iTunes or on your favourite podcast provider. We'd also really appreciate if you would review and rate our podcasts as well. Mā te wā, until next time.